With second interviews now underway to replace Pete Carroll, the Seahawks have placed a heavy preference on defensive-minded coaches so far. Who could be some offensive coordinator candidates to pair with these defensive head coaches? We're going to be breaking it all down on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, for this Tuesday episode by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there, whether you're listening in Othello, Washington, or Brussels, Belgium. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We have a jam-packed episode coming your way. We are going to look at some important salary cap-related dates for the Seahawks as they start to figure out their roster for the 2024 season and beyond. And we'll continue our report card, moving to the defensive side of the ball, in the trenches, the defensive tackles, what went right, what went wrong, and much more. It's going to be a jam-packed episode brought your way by our friends at FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. The Seahawks, yesterday, there were reports that surfaced they would have 5 candidates that they already had one interview with, that they would be meeting with for a second time. And Rob, you and I, we placed out our rankings of those 5 candidates, 4 of them being coaches with defensive backgrounds primarily. And that's maybe not a surprise considering how poor the Seahawks were on defense overall the last couple of seasons, even under a defensive coach in Pete Carroll. Knowing those names and the fact that there is such a heavy defensive emphasis, you and I saw the report that was out there today linking Chip Kelly, former NFL coach and current UCLA coach, to Dan Quinn as a potential partnership if Quinn gets the head coaching job in Seattle. And that got us thinking, what would be the ideal matches of offensive coordinators with head coaches from the 5 that were listed as second interview candidates for the Seahawks? And so I'm going to give you the mic here first. Knowing all these defensive-minded coaches, what would be a pairing of a head coach and an OC that would get you excited for the Seahawks?
It's very kind of you, Corbin. Thank you so much for that opportunity. And I think that, it's a fun conversation. I mean, because you are trying to match, just the personality types with how they are going to, kind of mix and match different scheme sets and things like that. I also think that it's important to have a little bit of familiarity. So this isn't fantasy football. You aren't going to necessarily be matching up, say, a Jim Harbaugh with perhaps a Chip Kelly, even though I think that a Harbaugh is obviously among the splashier names out there in the head coaching gauntlet. And, Chip Kelly, I mean, now he is the new name out there, and his the success that he has had in offense, not only in the NFL with the San Francisco 49ers, but obviously here with UCLA, previously with Oregon. I mean, he's had so much success. That is where a whole bunch of buzz is going to go to. But, despite what the Seahawks general manager, John Schneider, has said, he feels like this is a very enviable, position to hire for a head coach and presumably for offensive and defensive coordinators. I don't know that a lot of other NFL people are going to feel that same way. I think that you are going to have to hire a head coach. And again, in this case, we are presuming it's going to be from the defensive mindset. Then I think that the offensive coordinator that you bring in most likely is going to have some type of connection with whoever that head coach is. And as you referenced, Corbin, I kind of cast my vote for Raheem Morris, who is currently the defensive coordinator of the LA Rams. And if that is indeed the way that the Seahawks go, then I think it would make an awful lot of sense for them to bring in their offensive coordinator at this point, who is Zach Robinson. He is their current, the LA Rams' current quarterback coach, but he is interviewing several times now for different offensive coordinator positions. He's interviewed for the Saints, for the Raiders, for the Steelers, offensive coordinator spots. Zach Robinson, former quarterback himself. There are some ties there that I think would be interesting. So if the Seahawks do go with Raheem Morris, the coaching candidate who I think makes the most sense for the Seahawks, then I think the offensive coordinator that he might pull, again, would be somebody that he has familiar ties with, that being Zach Robinson, the current quarterback coach of the LA Rams.
Yeah, you mentioned this isn't fantasy football, and I'm not going to say that this is completely fantasy, this first one that I'm going to throw out here, but to an extent it is, because there hasn't been an interview for Mike Macdonald yet, at least reportedly with the Seahawks. I still think there is a chance that is going to happen, though, and there is another offensive coordinator out there that's got plenty of buzz about being an OC elsewhere, and he even interviewed in Washington for the head coaching job, and that would be Eric Bieniemy. This would be the dream scenario for me. Mike Macdonald, with the work that he has done in Baltimore, what that defense has done against some of the other juggernauts in the NFC West this year, and really everybody else. It's been the best defense in the NFL overall. They get a bunch of sacks. They get a bunch of turnovers. And Eric Bieniemy, I am still impressed with what he did with Sam Howell this year. We know his involvement with Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City for a number of years with their Super Bowl teams, 3 Super Bowl teams, 2 of those being winners. I would love to see Macdonald and Eric Bieniemy together, because I just think, maybe there'd be some questions about fit when they haven't been on the same staff together, but Mike Macdonald's going to want an OC that's really good with quarterbacks so that he can focus on his defense. Eric Bieniemy is as good of a quarterback coaching mind as there is out there. So I think this would be a really fun match to have with your head coach, if it's going to be a defensive-minded coach, and Eric Bieniemy, who could take another step towards getting his own head coaching job in the Pacific Northwest.
No, I think that's a really good point. And so just to kind of go off of that idea, then the hell with it. Let's just kind of throw caution to the wind. And, I think there's a lot of Seahawks fans out there, Corbin, who are saying, why are we going with perhaps a guy that is coming from a coordinator job? Why not just give the job to Mike Vrabel? I mean, he just kind of epitomizes the toughness that the Seahawks, frankly, have been lacking for the last couple of years. If you're going to go with Mike Vrabel, why not go with the former Atlanta Falcons head coach, who previously was the offensive coordinator under Vrabel with the Tennessee Titans, and that being Arthur Smith? I mean, talk about a guy who is as focused on running the football as, Pete Carroll and, some of the former Seattle offensive coordinators were. I think that would be a fun matchup. Now, again, these are 2 men who know each other very, very well. I don't know that this necessarily is the most realistic option, because we haven't seen that Mike Vrabel is among the most favored candidates that the Seahawks have demonstrated their interest in to this point. But still, if we are going to play that role of kind of dream matchups, then I do think Mike Vrabel and his former offensive coordinator at the Tennessee Titans, Arthur Smith, and his focus on running the football, I think that would be certainly my dream matchup if the Seahawks were going to become the black and blue kind of a club that I remember of years past.
Let's talk a scenario where 2 perceived finalists for this head coaching job end up coming together. And I think this is one that could happen because you mentioned the familiarity aspect. They coached in New York at different times, but Patrick Graham was the defensive coordinator in New York for a couple of years. And then Mike Kafka has been the offensive coordinator under Brian Dable the last couple of years with the Giants. And I could see that being a match that really works well because Patrick Graham has the leadership intangibles, the ability to win over the locker room, that he has earned that trust, multiple stops. And most recently with the Raiders, the work they did on defense, those last 9 games this season, 20 or fewer points in 6 of those games. And then Mike Kafka, I worry about his experience being ready for a head coaching job, but he has done some nice things as a quarterback coach and as an OC. I mean, the Giants finished 16th in scoring 2 years ago with Daniel Jones, which now remarkable. Saw this past season. That offense was a dumpster fire. They were playing Tommy DeVito for a big chunk of the season. I just still think that this is a guy that in an OC position where he's getting the play calling option, it could be a really good fit. And with both those guys having previous ties with the Giants, there may be a connection there. Let's real quick get to Dan Quinn, because that to me is kind of the elephant in the room here in the sense that we've seen those reports of Chip Kelly. But real quick, who would be an OC that you would like to see paired with Dan Quinn if he's going to be the Seahawks' next head coach?
Well, you mentioned one of the names that has a lot of buzz right now in Chip Kelly, but I actually kind of take a step back and look at Frank Reich, what he did as, the offensive coordinator with the Chargers, with the Eagles. Of course, he was the head coach with the Carolina Panthers before he got fired previously with the Indianapolis Colts as well. His ability to develop quarterbacks, I don't put any blame on the struggles of the Indianapolis Colts or the Carolina Panthers on his foot. I think that's more the owner, frankly, in both of those locations. I like the way that young quarterbacks developed under Frank Reich. And I think with Dan Quinn, you would, of course, have the defensive-minded personality that the Seahawks know very, very well.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Frank Reich as a play caller. We saw what he did in Philadelphia before he got his first head coaching job in Indianapolis. And the Colts had a few good seasons under him as a head coach. But I think as a play caller, he's a beloved, respected coach, too. You know that he knows the quarterback position. I'm going to go with familiarity here, though. Kellen Moore and Dan Quinn, they were both in the Cowboys staff together for a couple of years. And I know that some of the luster that Kellen Moore had earlier in his coaching career, it's worn off a little bit with the fact that he had Justin Herbert this season and the Chargers offense just couldn't get things rolling the way that they were expected to this year. But they had injuries. They had the issue of the head coach where Brandon Staley, whether fair or not, I mean, he got fired towards the end of the season, as he probably should have, because the game management stuff fell on his shoulders. I still think Kellen Moore coming back to his home state of Washington and teaming him up with Dan Quinn, a coach who knows him very well. They've been in the same staff together as coordinators. I think that would be a really solid fit, and I like him with Geno Smith too. I think his system, the things he did with Dak Prescott, Geno Smith can do a lot of those things really at a high level too. So that, to me, would be an interesting fit. Up next, we're going to be zipping over to some important dates to watch here coming up in the offseason in regard to the salary cap, most notably with Geno Smith. Don't go away. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. We're approaching NFL Championship weekend, but there's still time to get in the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's never been a better time to get in the action than Championship weekend. The app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options that can be found in the Parlay Hub, including spreads such as the 49ers against the Lions in the NFC Championship game, player props such as Jared Goff's total passing yards or touchdowns against the vaunted 49ers this weekend, over-unders, and much more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. There's obviously a ton of buzz out there right now about who's going to replace Pete Carroll. That is clearly story number 1, number 2, number 3 in the Pacific Northwest right now. Until that hire is made, that is going to be the top story in the Emerald City. With that being said, John Schneider's got other things that he's got to start preparing for, especially now that he has full power with personnel, full authority to make those decisions. There are some big decisions that await him, and it's not just March 13th when the new league year starts. There are some deadlines that are approaching much quicker than that. And Rob, the most important one, Geno Smith. We know he signed that 3-year extension last March worth up to $100+ million if he could have hit all the escalators. Did not do that this year. But He's entering the second year of that contract, and the Seahawks structured it to give themselves some flexibility to be able to get out of that contract if they needed to, with not much of a salary cap pain, so to speak. But that deadline is quickly approaching. They have to make a decision on whether he's going to be the guy or not by February 16th, 5 days after the Super Bowl, 5 days into the waiver period. There's $12+ million that becomes fully guaranteed on that day if they don't cut him or trade him by that point. So certainly that deadline stands out among several other player deadlines coming up. John Schneider's got to make a decision there, and that may escalate the look for a new head coach, because I would think that's going to be a pretty big topic of discussion for whoever's going to replace Pete Carroll.
Yeah, I love the way that you just described that, Corbin, because it is 5 days after the Super Bowl. It basically creates a deadline for when you can expect the Seahawks to make a decision at the head coach position, because, of course, as you just referenced, you're not going to be bringing in a head coach after you make the decision as far as who is going to be your quarterback. And it's not just Geno Smith. I mean, while that is obviously the biggest storyline here, you got DK Metcalf and Draymond Jones are also each due significant bonuses on February 16th. So just 3 weeks away from now. So there is an awful lot of big decisions that the Seahawks and specifically the general manager, John Schneider, are going to have to be making over these next 3 weeks. So while it may feel like there are 4 teams still in the NFL conversation, obviously competing for the Lombardi Trophy, and the other 28 are kind of starting to gear themselves up for free agency or for the NFL draft, the Seattle Seahawks might be as busy as anybody, because they have huge decisions to make here in these next couple of weeks.
Yeah, this is going to, and the crazy thing is, if you're going to want to hire Mike McDonald, for example, if the Ravens advance to the Super Bowl, and whether they win or lose, you can't make a hire with him. You're not going to be able to get an interview with him until after that. And so now you're looking at a 5-day window where you can maybe get an interview. Hey, Mike, we want to interview you and consider you for this position, but we also have a quarterback that we got to make a decision on in 4 days. And so pressure's on here. I don't know that the Seahawks want to get themselves into that position unless John Schneider, and I thought he had kind of a lukewarm response on Geno Smith's season when he was talking to reporters last week. And, maybe that was just to, hide things a little bit. Maybe it wasn't as much of an issue as what I took it, but it seemed like it was a pretty lukewarm response. So maybe he's made his decision already, and he's telling prospective coaches, hey, Geno Smith isn't going to be back next year. Nobody knows that, but he's not going to be back. Or he is going to be your quarterback, and you're going to have to be able to work with that. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. But again, as you said, this is 3 weeks away, February 16th. I mean, a little over 3 weeks away. We are looking at a quickly approaching deadline where if Seattle has not made a move to cut Geno Smith at that point, they could try to trade him after that, and that would make the rest of the contract go to another team. But they'd still have a dead cap hit that's going to be equal to if they cut him, which is going to be a little over $14 million. Still, you would save quite a bit of cap space doing that. And if you're going to keep him, this sets up something where you're going to have to look at restructuring. Do you turn some of that contract into a signing bonus so you can open up some cap space now? Because his cap hit jumps up to $31 million this season. So if he's going to be the guy, you would think that's something they're going to have to do. And there's all kinds of dominoes that come off of that.
Oh, there really are. I mean, just go another month in advance. And then here, March 11th to 13th. And you referenced this before. I mean, the league year starts on March 13th. March 11th is technically the day that teams can start to negotiate with free agents. But still, that March 13th deadline is when Brian Monet at the defensive tackle, of course, is coming off of an injury. Your kicker, Jason Myers. Uchenna Nwosu, I argued in yesterday's show, could have been the defensive MVP for this club. They are all due significant roster bonuses that the Seahawks have to kind of take into consideration as well. So it's not just that, should the Seahawks hire a guy like a Mike McDonald, as you mentioned a moment ago, in that possible scenario, they aren't going to be able to just make a decision or two and then take off for a month or two as far as a honeymoon period of when you sign to be the next head coach of the Seahawks. There are huge decisions that Seattle is going to have to make here moving forward before they ever even get into free agency, and who they might be able to kind of bring to Seattle to perhaps be able to compete for NFC West crown.
And again, the ripple effects of that Geno Smith decision, you are going to feel that the entire rest of the offseason. If they restructure him even, you are still going to have a pretty big quarterback contract, not one of the bigger ones in the league, but it's still a pretty good sized quarterback contract that is going to eat up a large chunk of your salary cap. If you decide before February 16th, you know what, Geno, 2 years, you've been pretty good for us, but we feel like it's time for a clean slate, and you release him, yes, you got a dead cap hit of 14 plus million, but you open up a lot of cap space that you can use for re-signing players, bringing in your next quarterback, potentially whatever moves you're going to make. So again, that decision, that is going to be the first domino that falls one way or the other that's going to dictate what the Seahawks are able to do building the rest of their roster. And some of that may hinder on what the coach wants to do as well. So there's all kinds of dominoes here that John Schneider's got in front of him, and we don't know how any of those are going to fall right now. I would think the only other player on here on our list, again, on YouTube, you guys can see this, but the players that have cap dates coming up where the Seahawks are going to owe them money, whether it's on February 16th or March 13th, Brian Monet is the one name on there. He's only got a $500,000 roster bonus, but I would find it hard to believe that coming off that ACL injury, missing all of last season, that they are going to hold on to him on that current contract. Maybe they release him and try to bring him back on a far less expensive deal. That may be something to do coming off injury, maybe one with some incentives mixed in. But Uchenna Nwosu, Jason Myers, DK Metcalf, those guys are going to be on this roster next year, you would think. And Draymond Jones, I would be really surprised, even though he had a disappointing season, as we'll talk about in the next segment. I'd be surprised after 1 year from signing that contract with him still only being 27 years old. I'd be surprised if the Seahawks moved on that quickly unless they were able to find a trade partner to move him. So I feel like most of these players are going to have these escalators come up, and the Seahawks are going to pick those escalators up. The Geno Smith question and then Brian Monet to a much lesser extent, those look to be the two that are going to be potentially one way or the other 50-50 decisions.
I 100% agree with you. And specifically here with Brian Monet, I mean, he signed a 2-year, $11 million deal, as we're going to talk about here in just a moment when we really break down the defensive tackle class, defensive tackle class for the Seahawks, I should say. That is an awful lot of money for a player who obviously missed this past season, but just looking at his production in prior seasons as well, I think the Seahawks basically were paying him for what they thought that he would become. And so that does make him a possible cap casualty, or at least somebody that you might be looking to restructure.
Coming up next, as you mentioned, we're going to be talking defensive tackles, part 2 of our final report card. What went right, what went wrong for the defensive tackles, and individual player grades. That will be coming up next year on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Game Time. If you've ever been to Las Vegas, you know the city never sleeps, leaving no shortage of fun activities to do. With an extra $100 in my pocket, I'd make sure to hit up one of the nice diners on the Vegas Strip and maybe see a Golden Knights hockey game. If that scenario sounds fun, it can be a reality with Game Time. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. And right now, all users get $100 off when they buy a big game ticket with the code Vegas100 with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. And thanks to Game Time's awesome flash deals feature, you can find awesome seats for all of your favorite events, and it's super easy. So forget about planning months in advance. Game Time has the deals for tickets right after the day of the event, and with their Game Time guarantee, you'll always get the best price. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Right now, Game Time users get $100 off a big game ticket with the code Vegas100. Just download the Game Time app and use the code VEGAS100 for $100 off the big game ticket. Or if you're not going to the game, use the code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Make sure to check out Locked On's first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today has your 24/7 coverage, the top sports stories of the day with local experts from Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. As we continue our final report card, we did quarterbacks last week. Now we're going to transition to defense. And going into this season, defensive tackle was a position group that we had circled as a potential Achilles heel for this Seahawks team. With all of the turnover they had at that spot, no true nose tackles that were healthy, at least, with Brian Monet being injured and missing the entire season. But even with the struggles this defense had, Rob, I think we're looking at what went right. A lot went right for this defensive tackle group this season that, quite frankly, exceeded everyone's expectations.
Well, they certainly did. I think that when you bring in a player like a Jaron Reed, you bring in a player like a Mario Edwards, and then, of course, you make the big trade for Leonard Williams, then it's easy to get an awful lot better at that position than the Seahawks looked in say, March or April of last season. At the same time, there definitely were some flaws. I mean, the Seahawks gave up the second most rushing touchdowns of any team in all of the NFL. And that is one of the biggest concerns that you have for this club moving forward. Some of those best players, Leonard Williams, for example, is a free agent. Jaron Reed is 32 years old. I mean, so you have some concerns about this position moving forward. But as you said, we thought that it could have been the Seahawks' biggest area of concern. And instead, because of the pressure, because of the toughness, frankly, that Jaron Reed, Mario Edwards Jr., and certainly Leonard Williams provided the Seahawks, I think this is actually a pretty strong positional group for the Seahawks moving forward. And I love the fact that we're having this conversation about the defensive tackle position here right after we had the conversation about quarterbacks. That quarterbacks and defensive tackles, I mean, the two positions couldn't be much more different, but from a Seattle salary cap perspective, there's actually is a lot of continuity between these two positions. Geno Smith, of course, is the guy that you have to figure out what you're going to be doing with moving forward. We just kind of talked about some of the key dates here. Again, February 16th being a key date for Geno Smith. March 13th is the drop down date for Leonard Williams because he is a free agent that could be due as much as, his average salary the last couple of years has been $21 million. Can the Seahawks really allocate that amount of money to a player that, as good as he was, is that really where you want to go? I think that he was spectacular for the Seahawks when they brought him here to Seattle. But again, that was in Pete Carroll's system. Would he be as successful in, say, a Raheem Morris or Mike McDonald or a Dan Quinn system? That is a conversation that I think that the Seahawks, obviously, and their head coach, whoever that may be, are going to have here in the next couple of weeks.
But if there's a reason to want to sign up for that, and we're obviously going to have more time to talk about the free agency stuff in depth, but Leonard Williams had 4 sacks and 11 quarterback hits in 10 games with this team. And I thought he was one of the more consistent run defenders they had during that time. And maybe that's not saying much because of how many yards the Seahawks gave up on the ground during those last 2.5 months, but he lived up to the hype. And then you look at Jaron Reed with 7 sacks, the second highest total in a season in his career. Only in 2018, when he had 10.5, did he perform better. He had double-digit quarterback hits. Both of those guys, Leonard Williams and Jaron Reed, were in the top 25 in pressures for interior defenders, according to Pro Football Focus. So you got the pass rush. Jaron Reed brought the leadership and the toughness in the middle. Leonard Williams really fit in nicely with this front line. And let's give some credit to the depth. I mean, Mario Edwards, at least the first half of the season, he gave them way more bang for their buck as a pass rusher than I ever could have anticipated. He had a strip sack in the game against the Giants. And then Cameron Young maybe didn't get a lot of pub, didn't play a ton of snaps, but he got better as the season progressed. And maybe that's your future nose tackle there that is going to get more opportunities moving forward. depending obviously on who the coaching staff's going to be. But I thought the depth was pretty solid, and I thought the pass rushing contributions in particular from the stars at the top, Jarran Reed and Leonard Williams, are pretty good. Now let's get to the negatives. You mentioned the run defense. Obviously, you got to put some of that on the defense. But Dre'Mont Jones, I don't want to pick on the guy too much, but when your average depth of tackle is 4.6 yards, which was dead last among defensive tackles, that jumps out to me immediately when we're talking DTs in particular. You're getting tackles way downfield. He missed a bunch of tackles this year, only got 3.5 sacks by my count. They may have given him a little bit more, but there was a couple of them that I thought maybe were not his. But anyway, he had a lot of pressures, 44 pressures, but it didn't translate into quarterback hits or sacks. And you paid this guy to be an elite interior pass rusher. They got that production from Jarran Reed and Leonard Williams. They did not get it from Dre'Mont Jones. So I think you couple that with the fact that there was inconsistency defending the run. Those were the two biggest issues on defense in this position group this year.
No, they really were. And I love the fact that you just mentioned just the, where he was making those tackles, because if all you do is just look at the statistics, if you didn't watch a single Seattle Seahawks football game and you just looked at Dre'Mont Jones' statistics this year, then you would note that he actually posted a career high 49 total tackles this year, a career high 12 quarterback hits this year. His 4.5 sacks are not that far off the career high 6.5 sacks that he had in a couple of other seasons with the Denver Broncos. And yet, to your point, Corbin, was there very many plays in which Dre'Mont Jones, considering he signed for a 3-year, $51.53 million deal? Did he really have that many impact plays? I would argue that Leonard Williams, in the small sample size that we saw, actually had twice as many big plays as Dre'Mont Jones had for the Seahawks. So, again, statistics suggest that Dre'Mont Jones had a very solid season for the Seahawks. I think the eye test suggests that he did not. And so,
the eye test definitely does not say that. And honestly, the stats, I feel like there's a lot of bloated statistics for Dre'Mont Jones. Those pressures, like when I go back and I watch the film, it's very quiet that he quietly is putting up those numbers in the sense that, yeah, he might be getting close to the quarterback, but what is he doing beyond that point and not getting many? He only had 5 tackles for loss, which is his lowest total since his rookie season. So the impact plays were not there at all that you were expecting from him. And they credit him with 4.5 sacks. There were a couple partials where I thought it was a little bit questionable that he got those. So the numbers could have been even worse, in my opinion. It just was not the season that you expected from him. And maybe a different coach, different coaching staff, they can bring out his potential again. But I thought that was the biggest downside this year. And that's why, to me, he's the lowest graded DT by a wide margin from this group.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. And again, I think you can make the same kind of argument with a Cameron Young. I mean, I was among those who was very much championing this young man. And I do believe that he has a great deal of upside to him. But the reality is that he is more of a run stuffer. He posted basically, 18 tackles in 16 games. Now, you love the fact that he was available for that number of games, but still 18 tackles, 1 tackle for loss, considering the fact that some of us expected him to play a significant role in this Seattle Seahawks defense. To me, as a whole, this was a defensive tackle group that maybe exceeded expectations, but only because the expectations were basically in the basement. And so I do think that if the Seahawks want to compete for Super Bowls, then this is a defensive tackle group that is going to have to play significantly better moving on.
That is going to be one of the most pressing questions when the new head coach is named. What is going to be that next step for this defensive line? Because Jarran Reed and Leonard Williams had really strong seasons. There were some hiccups in there defending the run, just like with everybody on this football team, but I thought they were rock solid. Mario Edwards gave them some solid contributions early in the season, not as much in the second half. Cameron Young, there were flashes, but he was a seldom used nose tackle. And as we've talked about, Dre'Mont Jones, the expectations for him were through the roof of the contract he was given, and he just did not come close to meeting those expectations this year. Maybe that turns around next season with a new staff in tow, but we shall see. This defensive line is going to be an interesting group to watch going into a new season with a new staff on board. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to look at some of the former Seahawks coaches under Pete Carroll that have already taken jobs and which ones could potentially return to Seattle with a new staff. You won't want to miss it. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Go Hawks.